They had no weapons, no army, no bombs, no means of force of any kind. What they had was a printing press, a stack of paper, some stamps, and the truth. And with these humble tools, a small group of university students set out to do something that seemed almost impossibly brave, to speak openly against the most powerful and ruthless regime of their age, from within its very heart, knowing that to do so was to risk everything. They wrote the truth, they printed it, and they sent it out into a nation gripped by fear and silence. For this, for words on paper, they would pay with their lives. This is the story of the White Rose and of the extraordinary courage of young people who chose conscience over survival. This is a story about moral courage in its purest form, about the power of truth spoken into silence, and about young people who refuse to be complicit in evil even when resistance meant almost certain death. It is a story that reminds us that not all heroism is armed, that some of the bravest acts in history were committed not with weapons but with words, and that the willingness to speak the truth when truth itself is forbidden can be among the most courageous things a human being ever does. And it is a story that has inspired generations, a testament to the enduring power of conscience against tyranny. To understand the magnitude of what these students did, you have to understand the world in which they lived, a world of enforced silence and pervasive fear. Their nation was ruled by a totalitarian regime that demanded total conformity and crushed all dissent with merciless brutality. To speak against the regime, to question its actions, to voice any opposition, was to invite the most severe consequences. The machinery of the state was designed to detect and destroy any hint of resistance, and the population had largely been cowed into silence, whether through genuine support, through fear, or through the desire to simply survive by keeping their heads down. In such a world, open opposition seemed not just dangerous but almost unthinkable. The regime had also led the nation into a devastating war and was carrying out atrocities of staggering scale, crimes against humanity that some within the country knew about or suspected, even as the official propaganda painted a very different picture. For those who became aware of the truth, who understood the moral catastrophe their nation was engaged in, there was an agonizing choice. They could remain silent, protecting themselves but becoming complicit through their silence. Or they could speak out at enormous personal risk, refusing to be party to the evil being done in their name. Most understandably chose silence. But a small group of young people chose otherwise. These were university students, young people in the prime of their lives, with futures ahead of them, with everything to lose. They were intelligent, thoughtful, and morally serious, and they had come to understand the true nature of the regime and the crimes it was committing. They could not reconcile themselves to silence. They could not accept being complicit, even passively, in such evil. And so they made a fateful decision to use the one means available to them, the written word, to break the silence, to tell the truth, to call on their fellow citizens to recognize the moral catastrophe unfolding around them, and to resist it. Now we should be honest about the history here, because the story of the White Rose is real and well documented, and it deserves to be told with accuracy and the deep respect it commands. What follows is grounded in the genuine record of these students and their resistance, though we will tell it as a narrative to convey its full meaning. The core is true. A group of university students really did form a resistance group that wrote and distributed leaflets condemning the regime and calling for resistance, and they really did pay for this with their lives. The details are recounted to honor their courage and convey the significance of what they did. The method these students chose was the production and distribution of leaflets, written documents that laid out the case against the regime and called on their fellow citizens to resist. These leaflets were remarkable documents, eloquent and morally powerful, drawing on philosophy, literature, and religious and ethical principles to condemn the regime and to awaken the conscience of the nation. They did not mince words. They named the evil, denounced the crimes, and called on people to recognize their moral responsibility to resist. They were acts of extraordinary intellectual and moral courage, speaking truths that the entire apparatus of the state was dedicated to suppressing. The students produced these leaflets in secret, at great risk, using a printing press and whatever materials they could obtain. And then they faced the dangerous task of distribution, of getting the leaflets into the hands of their fellow citizens. They distributed them through various means, mailing them to people, leaving them in public places, spreading them as widely as they could manage. Every step of this process was fraught with mortal danger. To be caught producing or distributing such material meant arrest, interrogation, and almost certain death. Yet the students persisted, driven by their conviction that the truth had to be told, that the silence had to be broken, that someone had to stand up and speak against the evil. Consider the courage this required, the sheer moral bravery of these young people. They were not protected by anonymity in any reliable way, not shielded by force, not backed by any powerful organization. They were students, acting on their own conscience, using the most modest of means against the most powerful of regimes. They knew the risks. They knew what would happen to them if they were caught. And they did it anyway, because they believed that some things are more important than personal safety, that there are moments when one must speak the truth regardless of the cost, that to remain silent in the face of such evil would be a betrayal of everything they believed in. There is something profoundly moving about the nature of their resistance, about its reliance on truth and words rather than force. They could not fight the regime with weapons, and perhaps they would not have chosen to, even if they could. Their resistance was of a different kind, a moral and intellectual resistance, an appeal to conscience, an insistence that the truth be spoken. They believed in the power of words, in the capacity of truth to awaken the conscience of those who heard it, in the moral force of bearing witness against evil. Theirs was the resistance of the spirit, of the mind, of the moral sense, and it was no less courageous for being unarmed. Indeed, in some ways, it was more courageous, for they faced the full might of the state with nothing but their words and their convictions. Inevitably, given the dangers they faced, the students were eventually caught. The machinery of the state, dedicated to detecting and destroying dissent, closed in around them. They were arrested, and they faced the full brutality of a regime determined to crush any hint of resistance. And here, in the face of capture and the certainty of severe punishment, they displayed a final, extraordinary courage. They did not crumble. They did not beg for mercy or betray their principles. They stood by what they had done, maintaining their dignity and their convictions even as they faced the gravest consequences. Their conduct in their final ordeal was as courageous as the resistance that had led to it. The students were condemned and executed, their young lives ended by the regime they had dared to oppose. They paid the ultimate price for their courage, for their refusal to be silent, for their insistence on speaking the truth. It was a tragic end for young people who should have had long lives ahead of them, whose only crime was to speak against evil, to call for justice and conscience in a time of darkness. The regime, in killing them, sought to silence them forever, to erase their voices, to make an example that would deter others from following their path. But here is the profound irony: the way that the regime's attempt to silence them ultimately failed. The students were killed, but their words survived. Their leaflets, their message, their example of courage outlived them and outlived the regime that had killed them. Far from being erased, they became symbols of conscience and resistance, their names honored and their courage celebrated long after the regime that murdered them had collapsed into ruin and infamy. The voices the regime tried to silence became, in the end, far louder and more enduring than the regime itself. The students achieved in death a kind of victory that the regime could never take from them, the victory of being remembered as heroes while their killers were remembered as monsters. There is a deep lesson here about the power of truth and conscience against even the most powerful tyranny. The regime had overwhelming power, controlled the entire apparatus of the state, commanded armies and police and all the machinery of oppression. The students had only their words and their convictions. By any measure of raw power, the contest was absurdly unequal. And yet, in the long run, it was the students who prevailed in the ways that ultimately matter. Their truth outlasted the regime's lies. Their moral courage outshone the regime's brutal power. Their names are honored while the regime is condemned. This is a powerful reminder that truth and conscience possess a kind of power that brute force cannot ultimately defeat, that the moral victory belongs to those who stand for what is right, even when they are crushed by those who do not. Consider, too, what the student's example reveals about individual moral responsibility, about the choice each person faces in the presence of evil. The students could have done what most did, kept silent, protected themselves, told themselves there was nothing they could do, but they refused this path. They recognize that each person bears responsibility for how they respond to evil, that silence in the face of atrocity is itself a moral choice, that one cannot escape responsibility simply by claiming powerlessness. They chose to act, to speak, to resist, accepting the consequences of that choice. Their example challenges each of us to consider how we respond to injustice, whether we have the courage to speak the truth when truth is dangerous, whether we will stand for what is right, even at personal cost. It is worth reflecting on the particular significance of the students' youth because it adds a poignancy and a power to their story. These were young people with all of life before them, with every reason to want to survive, to pursue their futures, to enjoy the years that should have been theirs. And yet they chose to risk and ultimately to sacrifice all of this for the sake of conscience. There is something especially moving about young people displaying such moral maturity and courage, about their willingness to give up so much for the sake of what is right. Their youth makes their sacrifice all the more poignant, and their moral clarity all the more remarkable. They remind us that conscience and courage are not the exclusive province of the old and experienced, that the young can possess a moral wisdom and bravery that puts their elders to shame. There is also a lesson here about the importance of bearing witness, about the value of speaking the truth, even when it seems to change nothing. The students could not, by their leaflets alone, bring down the regime or stop the atrocities. In practical terms, their immediate impact was limited, and they paid for it with their lives. One might ask whether it was worth it, whether their sacrifice accomplished anything. But the value of bearing witness is not measured only by immediate practical effect. By speaking the truth, by refusing to be silent, the students preserved the honor of conscience, demonstrated that not everyone had surrendered to the regime, and left a record of moral resistance that would inspire future generations. Their witness mattered, not because it immediately changed the course of events, but because it affirmed the enduring truth that evil must be named and resisted, even when the cost is high and the immediate impact uncertain. What makes this story endure is the purity and power of the courage it describes, the image of young people armed with nothing but truth, standing against the full might of a brutal regime. It captures something essential about the nature of moral courage, about the power of conscience, about the willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of what is right. The students of the White Rose did not defeat the regime in any military or political sense, but they achieved something perhaps more important, a moral victory that has inspired countless people and that stands as an eternal rebuke to tyranny. Their story reminds us that the human conscience cannot be entirely crushed, that there will always be those who refuse to be silent, and that the truth, however suppressed, has a power that outlasts even the most ruthless oppression. By the time their story reached its tragic conclusion, the students of the White Rose had given everything for the sake of conscience and truth. They had broken the silence, spoken against evil, and called for resistance, knowing it would cost them their lives. And though they were killed, their courage and their message survived, becoming a beacon of conscience that has inspired generations. They proved that even in the darkest times, even under the most brutal tyranny, the human spirit can refuse to surrender, that conscience can triumph over fear, and that the truth, spoken bravely, can echo far beyond the silence it was meant to break. So remember the students of the White Rose, young people armed with nothing but a printing press and the truth, who dared to speak against a brutal regime from within its very heart. Remember that they had no weapons, only words, and that with those words they committed an act of courage that cost them their lives. Remember their refusal to be silent, their insistence on bearing witness against evil, their willingness to sacrifice everything for the sake of conscience. And remember the profound truth their story reveals, that moral courage can outshine brute power, that truth can outlast tyranny, and that the willingness to speak against evil, even at the cost of one's life, is among the most heroic acts a human being can ever perform.